The transgender agenda has been exposed today. It's been revealed that the number of trans people in Britain who was probably grossly exaggerated in the latest census because the Office for National Statistics asked a confusing question. And the suspicion is that the wording of that question was set by a pro-trans lobby group. The ONS is now facing allegations that it fudged the numbers, inflated the amount of trans people in Britain, which empowered the trans lobby, who want to teach gender ideology to young children in schools. So the question that they asked in the 2021 census was this: is the gender you identify with the same as your sex registered at birth? Now, and this is actually genuinely quite comical. What appears to have happened is that migrants in Britain didn't understand that question and accidentally said that they identified as trans. So people with a foreign first language were 4 times more likely to say they were trans than those who have English as their main language. And again, quite comically, areas with big religiously conservative migrant populations, such as Brent and Newham in London, were found to have higher numbers of trans people than Brighton, an area with a notoriously high LGBT population. So what they should have asked is this: do you identify as trans? Anyway, the result of that census was that roughly 0.5% of the population was supposedly transgender. Well, it turns out that the reality is that an even smaller number of the population are actually trans. Now, Oxford professor Michael Biggs raised the alarm over this. He thinks that the ONS's close relationship with Stonewall, a trans lobby group with a tremendous amount of power, and another trans pressure group, Press for Change, might have led them to being captured by the trans ideology. Now, they deny this, but the ONS was a member of Stonewall since at least 2006. And a member of their Diversity Champions group until 2022. Of course, the year the census was done was 2021. So the ONS is not alone. Numerous government departments, quangos, etc., have all signed up to Stonewall. So what this means is that they can enter a thing called the Workplace Equality Index, which basically ranks organisations on how inclusive and diverse they are. Now, in fact, Stonewall's experts in LGBTQ plus inclusion have even created a, quote, sophisticated scoring system. So it's quite easy, isn't it, to see how that might make those companies or those government departments or those organisations behave in a way that overtly promotes trans ideology. The ONS has now downgraded the trans population stats from accredited official statistics to official statistics in development. Now, this begs the question that if even fewer than 0.5% of the population are actually trans, why is there such a big push to force this ideology onto children? Let's get our thoughts on my panel now. We've got royal journalist Sarah Louise Robertson. We're joined by political commentator and GB News star Alex Armstrong and the former elected mayor of Middlesbrough. It's Andy Preston. Sarah, I'll start with you on this. You know, when we factor this in, and it's even less potentially than 0.5% of the population that are actually trans, why is there so much fuss that's made about this? Why is it being taught in schools, etc.?
I think in this case, it is embarrassing for the Office of National Statistics that this information has now come to light. But I think in terms of the trans lobby themselves, you know, we don't want to increase hatred against them. I mean, in terms of like the trans population of the UK, there's been discrimination and bias towards them. We've seen that now. We've dropped on the index for trans people to live freely without discrimination and bias. In Europe, we've dropped right down in the index there. So I don't want to say something that's going to whip up more hatred towards them. But with these statistics themselves, I think we've shown that obviously it is a small amount. The figures obviously is going to be lower than what it is, but I don't know if it is necessarily Stonewall. I just think we live in times where people, you know, do live in fear of, you know, saying the wrong thing. And
yeah, well, clearly, Alex, on this though, you know, the trans lobby appears to have had this vice-like grip on power behind the scenes in government departments, whether it comes to education, whether it comes to just the corporate world. And I don't think there's much need for that. If it's something like 0.3% of our population.
Yeah, well, I mean, the reality is that I think you nailed it in your opening statement there, Patrick, is that the more people that identify as X, Y, Z, in this case trans, the more money that floods in, the more important these indexes become to say, oh, there's a growing trans population, we must do more in the NHS, we must do more in X, Y, Z, Cabinet Office must have more money to do that. And to me, this is all about a sphere of influence, power and money circulating amongst these very small quangos that have become extremely powerful to the extent they're influencing our census. And we are one of the very few countries in the world, I couldn't quite figure out how many there are, but it's very few that even ask a question like this in the first place. And the way it's written is so clearly biased. And it's so easy to misinterpret that if your English isn't quite right. And I think you nailed it at the start, that this is all about money and power shifting between these quangos.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I do wonder, Andy, whether or not this should serve as a massive pushback now for people who are desperate to teach this to primary school-aged children, whether or not they've been born on the wrong body. I mean, how many people are they really representing when they're teaching that stuff?
I think the tide's turning. Look, this was 3 years ago now, this question actually appeared. Why it was in there, who knows? Maybe it was pressure, maybe it wasn't. But the bigger issue is actually that organised pressure groups of any kind, this isn't just a trans issue, can terrify politicians, businesses, quangos, and achieve what they want if they're organised and scary enough. And think of as I say, I actually think the conversation has moved on. But the poor lady Kathleen Stock, the professor down in Brighton, who said nothing that anybody sensible would disagree with, was hounded out of her job. Hounded out. Poor woman. And she's one of hundreds. So to me, this is all about the pressure that tiny groups of organised activists, they can hold a country to ransom. It's madness.
And I call that group of people the trans mafia, because you look at the way that they've gone after the likes of J.K. Rowling, for example, for saying indisputable fact, which is that women are women, right? And if you deviate from that at all, then you can get cancelled, you can get threatened with court action, you can have your career ruined. Obviously, they can't cancel her because she's massive and wealthy, right? But if someone else, it's to try to silence people.
It makes it even more tragic to see what we're doing in things like places like the NHS on maternity wards, saying you have to ask it, are you a man or a woman, to a pregnant woman. It's absolutely ridiculous. And it makes all of those things that we've seen, all that wokeness that's been forced into the NHS, one of the most critical bodies in our country, even more despicable. And that trans mafia has become extremely powerful in our country, and places like Stonewall are absolutely perpetuating that narrative.
Sarah, yeah, go on. I mean,
I was just going
to put a pause on this headlong thing towards, we've got to, I mean, I interviewed women who are nurses in the NHS who were forced to share a changing room with a man who identified as a woman who was simultaneously trying to get his wife pregnant, and they were saying, look, can we stop this? We don't feel safe and particularly comfortable. And the NHS said to them, well, no, you've just got to deal with it.
I think we need to go back to the actual how embarrassing this is for the Office of National Statistics, and the question that we need to be looking at going forward, taking it away from just trans, is actually there's no legal requirement for these surveys to be carried out. What purpose do they actually serve? As I say, there's no legal requirement for us to know someone's ethnicity, someone's sexual gender, someone's sexuality. It's really it's the politicians, it's the government that is using this to put the public into boxes as a way to define us and control us. So I think we need to have pushback on these actual surveys, because they're not actually helping the general population, and actually they're not helping the trans population, because all it does is whip up hysteria and hatred towards a very, very, very small minority of people who should be able to live their lives as they so wish.
You might be right there, so, but the problem with these surveys is that they're happy to use them when it works for them. But if we talk about the national crime statistics, we're not allowed to bring ethnicity or anything like that into it. All of a sudden, that's not allowed. But when it comes to woke sort of topics, they're happy to utilise that. Like the thing like the trans lobby, for example, to get more money out of it, and to say, actually, no, this is part of our agenda. Look, there's a growing amount of trans people in the country, but if we were to say crime and ethnicity is on a similar trend, we wouldn't be allowed. And that's my problem.
And Andy, on this, things like the ONS, we use all the time, it's used in politics, journalists use it. We literally rely on this stuff. This is supposed to be, beyond reproach, beyond any kind of reproach. And the insinuation that, and they deny this, the ONS, but, signing up to things like the Stonewall, whatever it's called, charter, or however they phrase it, does beg serious questions. If that can be lent on in order to, in a way that can produce, frankly, duff information that we then rely on when we're doing things like coming up with government policy or reporting on things, that's a massive concern.
I think it all comes actually from government. There is huge pressure to the word they use is inclusive.
Yeah.
And that means actually adopt everyone. Of course, and I think we're all tolerant here, right? But what happens is tiny, tiny, tiny groups hold politicians and therefore all departments and businesses to ransom. And this is... The only way to fix it is to get the politicians to start being braver.
Yeah.
I fear, Patrick, that we're a long way from that happening. We're a long way from that happening.
I agree with you.
And it won't improve drastically till that.
But where does that fear come from? And this is the point that we raised earlier on. It's a fear of cancellation. It's a fear of being called a bigot. It's a fear of being ostracised from your friends and family. It's that fear of being called a transphobe. Whereas actually, if you had reliable data, the point is now we don't know.
Yeah.
But let's say it's 0.3 or 0.2 of the population. Of a population of 70+ million people in Britain, it would give people much more weight when they say, hang on a minute, do we have to have a charter in every single corporate business? Do we have to have it enshrined into our education system? Do children from a very young age do we have to have these maternity wards where you have to ask if someone's a chest feeder or not before? Because actually it affects a small number of people.
Yeah, it's an extremely small... I mean, it's obviously smaller than we thought it was as well, which makes all of this nonsense even more wild. I mean, you're seeing young people being forced to put pronouns into everything. This is part of that ideology, right? Yeah. And it even goes into things like social media and LinkedIn. You have to display whether you're a he, him, a she, her, and it's penetrated millions of ordinary people's lives. And it's out of fear. And I speak to my younger brothers, they're in their early 20s and they're going into the workplace, and if they don't seem to be an ally of any of this, then they're shut out.
Well, that's the problem. And Sarah, just final point on this. You know, I obviously don't want to see any hate, and I don't think anyone wants to see any hate.
Think about what happened to that lovely young girl, Brianna.
Absolutely, of course. And those things are desperately awful and wrong. But you can't... Well, the facts are facts when it comes to numbers. And when it comes to disproportionately women who speak out about this and whether they feel safe in their own spaces, etc., very often they get called TERFs. They get called, you're a TERF and you're cancelled. I mean, a lady who was a Labour MP who was desperately trying to be on the board for women inequalities, who said that her main mission was to oust TERFs and all this. And then you also see people who maybe lean to the right and are pro-Brexit and all that, you know, vilified as quite gammons. You're all gammons. You're this. It seems like there's a lot of mean language being flown about there, not actually entirely towards trans people.
I do take your point, but I think a lot of this is really within the metropolitan media bubble. And actually, if you go outside of that and you speak to ordinary people who are going about their lives, this probably hasn't even registered with them. They don't really care what the Office of National Statistics says. They probably don't care if George wants to be Georgina. I think most people just want people to live their lives.
If it's in the census, sorry to interrupt. Well, I agree with you, but if it's in the census and you're having to fill a form out at work, it is in your life, isn't it? And you're starting to normalise
then we need to
I think that's the issue.
I agree. As a population, we need to stop filling in these surveys. That's what we need to do. If they can't collect the information that they're trying to get, and they don't get the results, then they can't actually do anything with it. So I think that we need to stop answering these surveys.
There is a mass tyranny of minority in this country, and normal, ordinary people are scared. People are losing their jobs over it in some cases.
But don't engage with it.
I absolutely agree with you, Sarah. We should stop engaging.
We could we could stop engaging, or we could rely on the people that we are supposed to trust to actually ask the correct questions. And we also currently have...
Rely on politicians, Patrick.
Well, the ONS is not supposed to... Yeah, we also currently have a government, and this is not just this government, it's the government before, so it's a problem with I would argue, a wider political issue or a wider governmental issue, which is when it comes to trying to get hold of stats for things like, you know, what is the benefits situation when it comes to people who just arrived in this country, and they refuse to engage with us on that. That's a problem. Why don't you just put it out there in the open so we can have a more informed debate? Because you either do that, or you stop having a go at people who put out quotes and quotes misinformation. Because if you don't give us the information, it becomes very difficult. But we're going to have to whiz it on. Great start. Thank you very much. And now the Office for National Statistics Regulation, which examined claims over the 2021 census questions, said this. Some users have raised concerns that ONS has been captured by interest groups, leading to a lack of objectivity. We found no evidence of this form of bias to any of our work. We consider it regrettable that the ONS's defensiveness has created an impression of bias to some external observers. So you can make of that what you will.